I was thinking that we could start by just describing the problem space, sort of doing a very small introduction on ourselves, and then open it up to questions from the audience. I really like the format that Jim O'Shaughnessy used last week, launching OSV, where he basically brought people up. And because as you know, the total information war, whatever you want to call it, the information environment is so complicated that there's probably a wide variety of positions of our, some people will be like really informed and some people will be like, wait, what are you guys talking about? So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think brief introductions and then, just kind of, I don't know if, Q&A is the right way to put it, but, certainly, bring up whatever you think is most important. And, I'd like to, ideally connect it to things that are, not necessarily in the momentary news cycle, certainly over the past week or month or so, if possible, so we can kind of put things into more context.
Great. All right. Why don't you kick it off and introduce yourself, and I'll introduce me, and then I'll give a little bit of primer, and then we'll just get going. We're here at
Yeah.
one.
Yeah, so I'm Wolf McNally. I'm a technologist. I call myself a creative technologist, and I've been writing software for well over 40 years. Um, I've written many iOS apps, including like the iOS app for eHarmony, the matchmaking service. I'm best known for my critical thinking software, Flying Logic, at flyinglogic.com, which is used all around the world. And certainly helping people think better is a big part of my mission in life. That I think dovetails nicely with you, Mike. So let's hear about you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a little bit younger than Wolf, although I have been programming for going on 25 years now. I got really interested growing up on the internet, Usenet, bulletin board services, in the way that information propagated over networks. So I was pretty early on involved on the Usenet channel alt.parallels, which was all about using, Beowulf, which are commodity supercomputers to do computing. And then everything sort of cascaded from there for me until 2008, when I shifted from being an alleged hacker to being sort of more of like a white hat person. And then a few years later, formally entered the workforce. Since then, I've been working on infrastructure that billions of people use on a semi-frequent basis. And now I am trying to teach all the things that I've learned, because I've seen a lot of people in my personal circles succumb to really bad information diets and then have not great outcomes. And I think, like all of us, I'm just trying to learn. And I think part of that is sharing what I have learned and hopefully get something positive out of it.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the most interesting parts of your message is to characterize things as an information diet. We're all gobbling information every day, and what we take in is what you are, what you eat, right? So I think it's a really valuable way of looking at things.
Great. Okay, so where should we begin? What should we talk about first, Wolf? What do you think?
Well, what's top of mind right now for you? Obviously, there's a huge amount going on in the world. I'm becoming more and more aware of geopolitics through people like Peter Zion, and I'm very interested in the rise of AI. Of course, I also work in cryptocurrency, blockchain world, and so on. So I'm very interested in a lot of these technologies that are shaping our world. But I want to make the understanding of these things relatable to people and help people learn how to think about it. But what are you thinking about right now that you I guess you would hope people would be thinking better about than they clearly are right now?
Yeah, I think for me, upstream of those issues, all of them are very interesting, is what is the problem? Right? Like I keep coming back to how are we defining what the problem is? Because we all have to make decisions all the time based on limited information in a timely manner. And we can quickly and easily get overwhelmed by the number of sources and just the amount of information. And so I'm always coming back to, okay, what is the problem and what is my sort of best way forward? And spent a lot of time reaching out to other sense makers to ask this question, what is the problem? And as far as I can tell, the problem is that the amount of information we're asked to deal with on a regular basis is orders of magnitude, 100, 1,000 times more than the system that we use for understanding that information. And what do I mean by that? If you could imagine your great great grandparents They were just as smart as we are today, just as capable, but the amount of information they were exposed to on a daily, weekly, monthly basis was much less than us. And as a result, they had more time to think about each piece of information and to process both the source and everything about it. Whereas today, I'm asked to make decisions on information that comes to me in a very rapid fire, sort of like news media way. And I went to school and I learned how to go to the library and how to research things and how to cite my sources and all of that, and sort of what the best way is for doing that. And I don't find the environment that we're in today well suited to that sort of deliberate thought process, right? Where uncovering the truth of something is important, yes, and being able to act on that information with a lot of noise and on a quick enough basis, it seems to be where things have headed. And so for me, I'm always trying to come back to, okay, what is the problem? There's too much information. Great. How am I going to scope down the information? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to identify, what is it that I'm trying to do? What is it I'm trying to learn? And be very deliberate about pruning my diet. Like you said, we are what we eat, of things that are not good. Right. So that's from a Genesis point, that's where I start, right? So I think of it like it's a buffet, like Fresh Choice. I don't know if you remember that place. You
Of
can
course.
literally eat whatever you want. If you watch people get food at a buffet, they get a little bit of everything, and then they come back for the thing they actually want to eat. And that's kind of how I look at the information environment, is that we have all of this choice, and I really got to be specific about what it is that I'm going up to eat when I go and I select it.
Yeah, one thing that I sparked on when you said that was, of course, a lot of what I deal with in terms of, my tool, flying logic, and all that is what's called theory of constraints. And one of the first ideas of theory of constraints is understand your goal, and a goal is however you measure success. That can be, obviously individuals can have many goals. Companies often have a goal of making money, but if you don't understand the goal, if you don't understand what you're after when you say go after information, then your outcome is going to be directionless drifting. And so what I hear you saying is that you need to be very targeted in how you seek out information and the quality of information you seek out, but that requires a certain amount of self-reflectiveness I don't think a lot of people have right now.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I feel there's a lot of people that say, oh man, people's ability to make decisions is getting worse. Our critical thinking is getting worse. All of this kind of gloom and doom. And I just don't see that as being true. And sort of like my thought experiment to prove this is, in the 1960s, if you were to ask school children what they wanted to be when they grew up, they would tell you astronaut, president, CEO, right? And
Hmm.
today, when you ask those same school children what they want to be when they grow up, they say influencer, influencer, influencer. Now, I know you
Hmm.
might be saying, oh, this is terrible. But if you think of it in terms of, there's this guy, Leroux, who wrote Reinventing Organizations. He gives a framework for how humans organize themselves into work. In the 1960s, the CEO, the president, and the astronaut are all the person at the top of a great pyramid, that they have this enormous leverage, right? How many thousands of people were involved in the Apollo program so that three people
Hmm.
could go to the moon and only two would
Yep.
actually land on the moon, right? It's
Yep.
absurd how many people there are. And it's the same with the CEO and it's the same with the president. Today, as networks become more important, the network node, so that would be the sort of the person that has the most following, if you, the curator, has so much more power than even a CEO. Like, you could argue that a lot of what's happening in business are basically frontline employees who have been able to weaponize the conversation of the moment online against their CEOs into adopting all of these really radical policies. And you saw that, play out over and over again with a number of companies where they've taken these progressively more extreme positions, and often to their detriment. I think there's a meme about this: go woke, go broke. And so you see that happening, right? And so then you're like, well,
Hmm.
who really has the power? Is it the CEO of Disney, or is it that frontline employee? And sort of we're watching
Yeah.
in real time that battle. So I take back that people are less critically able. I just think that instead of being able to go a mile deep and an inch wide, they have to go a mile wide and an inch deep. And so they're just totally frazzled.
Unfortunately, I think that attracts a lot of people to that influencer role who are basically, attempting to get by on, say youth and looks rather than skill or wisdom or anything deeper to contribute to the conversation. It literally is a mile wide and inch deep, and that's obviously you and I think I'm fair to characterize. We are nascent influencers ourselves, but we also have a lot of life experience. And I think some pretty deep things to share. We're not showing off cosmetics or our bodies or anything like that.
Well,
So go
hang
ahead.
on. I want to push back there because
Sure.
we have a mutual friend who's a doctor, and he always said this, which totally
Hmm.
shocks me, which is that among healthcare professionals, they have the same incidence of obesity and metabolic dysfunction as the general
Yeah.
population. And so, what
Hmm.
I think is happening with the curators is that we are relinking authenticity and basically like responsibility and authority, right? So, the doctor may know the right information, but if they're a fat doctor, I don't really want to listen to them. And
Yeah.
so when I see a curator online, and many of them are, very close to us on the internet, one of the ways that I sort of evaluate their information is how is it working out for them? Is this the kind of
Yes.
person that I want to be like at like a total level? And then,
Hmm.
iteratively evaluate every single statement that they're making, and then asking myself, okay, if I follow the information that they're giving me, am I getting the result that I'm looking for? And does the evidence that they're presenting for a particular position weigh against the magnitude of that position? Right. So, like
Right.
Elon famously says, if there were really aliens, that's a really extreme claim. That's a very large claim. And so the amount of evidence that we should have for that is massive. And I think when I'm looking at influencers, so I'm not talking about like I don't actually want to label people specifically, but there are Gen Z influencers who seem to be very much like, I'm hot, whatever. I'm not talking about those
Hmm.
people. I'm talking about
Fair
people
enough.
that are in the trenches, who are keeping logs, who are presenting information day after
Hmm.
day. And
Hmm.
sometimes they're really contrarian, and it's very difficult to listen to their information because it challenges a core assumption that I have. And then, of course, that's a whole
Sure.
rationale for challenging that. Yeah, I think the curators that we're selecting for are really quite good only when their message is contrarian to the zeitgeist. So there's a lot of curators, influencers whose messages align with the zeitgeist, and it's very
Hmm.
difficult to sort out the legitimacy of what they're saying, the reality of it, from the social truth of the swarm that they belong to. Whereas
Yeah.
there are people, especially early on in COVID, this is where my eyes opened, who had positions that were against the zeitgeist and that there seemed to be evidence for. And what I find
Hmm.
amazing about a lot of these guys is that they sit just at the edge of the Overton window, and so they don't get canceled. But they say things that are the opposite of what the mainstream is saying, and yet they don't get canceled. And that tells me that there's probably something here, because if they said something that was opposite of the mainstream, that wasn't actually based in some kind of reality that I might share, I think they would get immediately canceled. Sort of like how we walk by the guy in San Francisco. I think, Wolf, you also live here in the Bay Area, who's screaming about the end of the world, down there on Market Street. You sort of walk by that person, you say, oh, that's very sad. When there are people online who commit the same sins, I sort of walk by them as well. And so they don't really get these really massive followings. But then there are people who are like, hey, there's something going on with this COVID thing. We should check that out. Right. And I remember being in San Francisco with Nancy Pelosi saying, it's all fine. And then all of a sudden it wasn't fine. And it's interesting for me to have watched people change their positions. And it was challenging to me because I got really stressed out. I got COVID and went to the hospital on February 5th, 2020.
Mm.
And I'm like 30 years, I don't know how old I was. I was in my early 30s and healthy. And so I was like, oh my God, this is really going to wipe people out. Anyway, so it's just some
Yeah.
thoughts.
Just one quick thing I want to kind of get closure on that you said is, obviously when we talk about people, kids aspiring to be influencers, often they are aspiring to be those Instagram kind of influencers. So if you want to separate those out and say, okay, not those, that's fine. I agree definitely that there's a lot of people who have a lot of deep thinking, and none of whom I agree with entirely, but are all worth listening to, and kind of. Seeking out those people and then how to sift through what they're saying, because they're obviously not all in agreement, is one of the big challenges I think an aware individual has right now in this, like you said, this information overload environment. Um, did you want to, get some other speakers in here?
Yeah, I'd love if anybody wants to ask a question for us to answer. Please raise your hand, and I don't know how it works, but I think Wolf and I will see it, and then
I'll invite you to be a speaker if I see your hand raised, and then you can just take the microphone and let us know what you're thinking about. Um, um, so I'm not seeing any hands raised yet. So
okay.
if somebody just so if somebody does want to, if I see that, I will definitely um, invite you up. And let's see. Okay, hang on. Get a quick view of speaker requests. Okay, how do I do that?
Yeah. Otherwise, I could talk about a whole bunch of issues.
Okay, there is a request.
Yeah,
Okay.
bring him up.
Yep. Yeah. So Andrew Schnecker, there you go. You are now a speaker. What's on your mind?
Awesome.
Please.
Love the conversation so far. One thing I'd love to get your take on is I see a lot of people who I think unnecessarily add to their information environment by saying, I need to get both sides of this perspective. And I think sometimes it may be warranted and sometimes it might not be. But I just wanted to get your take, Michael, on um, kind of listening to I need to listen to Fox News or I need to listen to CNN. And kind of how you cluster, you know, what your signal is. And is that just kind of an outdated way of thinking?
Yeah. Thank you for the question, Andrew. This is a complicated topic because I remember growing up that I used to read the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and many, many other periodicals to try and get a balanced perspective on what was going on. And to put this as simply as possible, in the previous sense making environment, there was consensus among people who read the news. Like you could read the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and have a pretty good grasp of what was going on politically and in business. There was a good sense back then of where we were and where we were going, right? So we had pretty wide scale agreement on A, and we had pretty wide scale agreement on B, right? So we would say something like, um, there are 8% of Americans are unemployed, and wouldn't it be great if we could get to a place where only 4% of Americans were unemployed, right? And then you would watch editorials in the Wall Street Journal or other newspapers argue for different positions. And so the arguments were largely how to go from A to B. And they, would fall down on sort of this sort of dichotomous or sort of two-sided politics, left, right. And so some people would say, oh, we should focus on equality of opportunity, and some people would say, oh, we should focus on quality of outcome, and that was the general format of the conversations that we were having. What I have seen happen in my lifetime is that the conversations we are having today are no longer about the best way to go from A to B. We are endlessly discussing what A is. And so what I find is that if you try to consume arguments from someone who is talking about the best way to go from A to B, and then somebody else considers A to be something different, call it A prime to B, you will go psychotic. And I have watched people do this where they try to consume informations because they're at a fundamental switch track about fundamental definitions. As an example, suppose you have two doctors that are discussing policies related to the COVID-19 epidemic and vaccine, a very hot topic right now and one that we've all felt very acutely. We don't really have a good sense as a society about what the definition of died with COVID versus died from COVID versus sort of like incidental COVID exposure, et cetera, et cetera. And all of the mainstream statistics that we got during that entire pandemic about what was the case, what was not, that was all very interpretive based on where you sat in the information environment. Moreover, it's not just limited to sort of complex topics like COVID. We don't have any consensus at a societal level on what it means to be a woman, right? You have one group of people that have one definition and one group of people that have another definition. Now, of course, if you're acting on one definition versus another through a long enough time, you'll be able to see the results of that. But from a policy perspective, if you have people that fundamentally disagree on the definitions, there's no way to reconcile their policy positions. And so you
Michael, do you think that there is a strategic element to how people are using words? Obviously the analogy that gets used a lot, I use a lot myself, is Orwell's newspeak. As that redefining words or removing words or banning words is being used strategically now, and that's actually a big part of where these we can't agree on what A is anymore, because it's being strategically redefined by people who have a lot of cultural and societal pull to be something that they think is better, more inclusive, but is actually from another perspective very undermining of the structure of society.
Yeah. Well, that's a more complicated question as well that actually gives us an even larger surface to talk about, which is, well, first of all, for all of human history, we have argued about the definitions of words people in power have in order to expand their power, right? And what you can see is that people who are anti those in power will come up with a different definition, et cetera, et cetera. The reason why I think it's worse today in terms of these definitions and why we have so much more difficulty is because we never reach a consensus, right? So in the olden days, when you had to distribute information via newspapers or broadcast television or on horseback, there was a cost to distributing that information. And as a natural consequence of the fact that there was a cost, you would build what are called supply side economies of scale. So the New York Times, because it had a higher readership, therefore had more people receiving its newspapers, therefore could hire better journalists, therefore could report the news more accurately than a smaller regional newspaper could, right? That's what it means to have a supply side economy of scale, is that you tend to see the cheapest cost come to dominate. Because the internet has made information free to distribute or near free, now we see demand side economies of scale taking place, right? And the easiest one to point to is Google. People don't use Google because it's cheaper than Bing. As you know, Wolf, I worked in search for a number of years and I did millions of tests on Google and Bing search results. They're virtually identical, and yet people have a preference for Google over Bing, and it has nothing to do with costing. And you can see this play out in other sort of technology industries. So when we talk about like antitrust, which is a supply side economy of scale thing applied to a technology company like Facebook, which is a demand side of economy of scale, it's very, very confused and it doesn't work. And so it's this problem. And I know I'm wandering a little bit, but I just like fundamentally, if you want to look at, if we want to bring in Boyd's OODA loop, and sorry, everybody, um, observe, orient, decide, act, the area of action has moved from observation to orientation, right? So when information is free to distribute, then it's very difficult, if not impossible, to keep secrets. And so all the money that you used to use and spend on secret keeping, you now spend on orientation, which is to say mis and disinformation. So there's an economic incentive for people that want to act in the environment to hijack words and their meanings to disorient the collective action of their adversary, right? And they do that by flooding the zone with misinformation and disinformation. And the problem is that in a war, traditionally, there would be two sides, and we had evolved to a place where those sides were known, right? They wore uniforms. There was a code of conduct. Yes, people don't really follow the code of conduct, but there was one. And they would try to, and their societies would hold them at some level accountable. And then when we talk about what's called a total war, that would be a point where the civilians were just as being attacked as the individuals were. And that's what's happened in our information war, is that it's become a total war in the sense that it's no longer nation states that are doing spy versus spy stuff in the observation part of the OODA loop. It's everyone doing orientation stuff, because every person who's connected to our media and information environment is both a civilian and a combatant. Every time that you retweet, every time that you read something, every time that you spread a mimetic idea, whether it's like an actual image that's a meme or talking to your friend, you are reinforcing or denigrating a particular position. And it might be a position that has high resonance with you and might be in alignment with your goals and incentives, or it might be one that's not. And again, because all this money is now going towards mis and disinformation, and the whole point is to retard your enemy's ability to form consensus, to block them from acting in the environment. And I apologize that we just went into like a crazy all this theory, but that is what's happening, right? And that is driving the conversation. Like, there are obviously people who believe some of the insane things that people are saying what a woman is versus not, but there's more people who are using it to their advantage for whatever purpose that they may have. It's kind of like the people who are most adamant about homelessness being solved in San Francisco are the ones who get the most money from homelessness being solved in San Francisco. It's really sick and gross. You don't want to look into any of this stuff too much.
Yep. By the way, I put a couple tweets up. I'm not sure how to quite put things in the nest of the space yet, so I'm still figuring that out. But I did put a couple tweets on my on my timeline. One of which is a video I did recently on what's called the persuasive definition, which is essentially how people define things to persuade people as opposed to just merely inform. And the other is the OODA loop diagram, which when I figure out how to put these things up in the nest, I will. Is there, Andrew, did you want to ask a follow-up, or is there anybody else who would like to speak? Please just, mark yourself as a speaker, and I'd be happy to bring you up anytime.
I want to ask a question to Andrew. So, Andrew, I think you're in the healthcare industry. Do you see what we're talking about play out there?
Definitely you see it play out, and I think you touched on this a little bit, but, I think that the best example of it is in the kind of like peer-reviewed community. The peer-reviewed research is kind of something that's been relied upon to kind of formulate somewhat of a consensus. And I think if we've learned one thing through, COVID is at least some doctors I know that are talking on Twitter Spaces are talking about how, for the first time I've kind of seen that there might be something behind these top 5 journals, and that there was a study, it looked good, we were excited about it, and then all of a sudden it came out, and then it was forced to be retracted, or something. They're like that. It felt like there was a hand on the lever, and I think from the aspect of trying to form consensus around even like a treatment for COVID, and a consensus around I think there's this fight between, well, we came through the institutions, we trust the institutions, so we have to do what the institutions say, but they have to balance that. If you ask 9 out of 10 doctors, do the pharmaceutical companies have a tremendous amount of influence over the medicine they practice? They will all say without question, absolutely. You can point out, hey, this vaccine happened to, bivalent, it was tested against 5 mice, yeah, they're like, yeah, kind of wild, huh? And then they'll just go get right in line, but I'm seeing more and more, I think a lot of it, some people are reaching their breaking point. Some people are just trying to get out. I think some people are saying, hey, let's kind of recalibrate here, because this is not the way that we've traditionally done things. But it's that at the end of the day, it's very hard to stick your head out when you have, such great financial interests, like, oh, I have student loan debt, I have bills to pay. It's who actually wants to be that person to stick their head out and fight for, what, even though in their gut they believe to be true. And then that persuades so many people, and those ones that are sticking their head up, it's kind of like they just get whacked down. I think I saw a tweet today where somebody was like, objective, really no skin in the game. They're just kind of like, hey, I'm seeing a lot of things about the vaccine that, seem like is becoming a consensus that this thing is not good. And then the reaction was just like, very, very positive. And someone was like, where do I get the other side? And then, you know, yesterday I made a comment on somebody who was very much for it, saying, hey, have you looked at this? I get dunked on. So it's like I have two different threads going. I've tapped into like a pro on a topic of health and someone negative on, I'm getting dunked in one side, I'm getting liked in the other. And all the people who are for something, they want to see a credentialed person. And it's, I'm sitting back kind of in the middle of all this, kind of surveying the landscape of healthcare and going, if the people with the credentials are starting to stand up and say this is a problem, and then they're getting canceled, how do we move forward? How do we rebuild consensus? Do we just have to kind of build awareness of the faults that exist within the system? Or do we build a new system? Or it just seems like this is going to be something that's going to be a long grind forward, taking years and decades to kind of see how this all plays out. So,
Michael, if you know, when
Thank
you
you,
address
Drew.
that, would you can also kind of address the idea of, you know, how this plays into the value of freedom of speech? Because obviously, you know, freedom of speech is a constitutional right. It's not necessarily, you know, protected outside that, but it's, you know, it's a value that I think that is being, you know, we're kind of speaking at with this conversation.
Yeah, I don't want to get into sort of like the derivation of freedom of speech in the West and sort of what it means, but I would say that what Drew brought up, which is this the violence of excommunication as a mechanism to enforce consensus in a group, is a problem for institutions when those institutions are not able to be accountable to the people that put them in place. So, for example, the CDC comes up with guidance, and in a perfect world, the CDC has collected information, has run it through a collection of experts. They have voted and come to some kind of consensus on what the position of the institution will be. And then they put that out to their people, in this case, doctors, in the middle of a pandemic. And then those doctors execute on what the CDC has said. The problem is that there is a lot of evidence that that process has been corrupted through differing incentives, right? So you might call it regulatory capture, you might call it the revolving door of business relationships between members at the top of these organizations and industry. And as Drew pointed out, you know, a lot of doctors will tell you there's an influence for pharmaceuticals. And of course, when there's an influence, a financial influence, that's who funds the journals, that's who funds the studies, that's who funds the medicine. And so then if you are an independent doctor, right, and you have a question about what has happened institutionally, the position that you're in, and the institution sees that question as threatening, then they excommunicate you. And so if you're in a situation where you have $500,000 in medical debt, or you need to have the institutional support to get clients, because if you're not a member of the AMA, you can't basically practice medicine in the United States. That is a very strong incentive for you not to question the information that's there, even though you might know, as Andrew pointed out, that your patients are suffering from the standard of care, right? In an ideal system, we would like to see that information trickle back up and then the position of those institutions to change. And my biggest contention throughout this whole thing is not that the CDC or the FDA or the NIH is wrong, it's that they're slow. We saw on the ground people responding to COVID faster and more effectively than the government. And then the government policies came in and basically swept that aside. You know, like people stopped purchasing things in early March of 2020 because they were concerned about this virus. They had seen some what now appear to be fake videos coming out of China, but nevertheless, they had seen some videos that scared them. And so they stopped using their credit cards. They stopped going out. And a few days later, it was the president who announced, okay, we're going to do a full scale shutdown. But effectively, people had already shut down. So the network of people had already done what they were supposed to do. They'd already come to a conclusion on what was the best thing to do, which was in my opinion, a precautionary principle. Let's wait and see. And then what was very fascinating is that network quickly found out within a few weeks that, there was a very specific group of people that were going to have trouble, but for the most of everybody else, there wasn't going to be an issue. But then the government didn't relent. And so we got in this point where the institution figured out, hey, we can expand power and we can um, work, and there's no accountability. And there's no accountability for your institution to the people that you're supposed to be serving. This is a real problem. And then you get that situation where the excommunication thing is a problem. And like, to Drew's point, this is a collective experience that we're going through that will probably last the rest of our lives. Like, then there's going to be rounds of people saying, oh, well, we can reform these institutions and we can elect new leadership in. And I'm all for that. And I'm going to vote for them and I'm going to do that. But I actually think that fundamentally, because the internet exists and makes information free to distribute, that the model of decision making has permanently shifted from consensus to resonance. And the economics behind that shift, I think it will take us 2 generations for the majority of people in society to figure that out. Sorry, Wolf, I interrupted you.
That's okay. That's I think the distinction you made just between consensus and resonance is a really important one, and I definitely would like to explore that more with you in our future spaces. Owen, I think you asked to come up as a speaker. I'd like to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah, thanks. I think one of my questions is, as we look at this concept of information war, and I compare it to like kinetic war, typically in the past, you would think of a war as a conflict between 2 opposing sides. And what you're describing seems like it's not like that at all anymore, because you have all these different participants that have their own interests and maybe they're all fighting. So one of my questions would be, how do you even identify, like friend and enemy in a conflict where it's not really clear who's on what side or who might be cooperating, or, where you stand in all of this?
Yeah,
I wonder if friend and enemy is even a meaningful concept. Michael, what do you think?
I was going to say there's a couple of things I wanted to talk about. The first one is the way the US government responded to the Polish MiGs is really fascinating to me. And just to give everybody a brief recap, during the Ukraine crisis, Poland offered to send MiGs, which are like planes, fighter planes, to Ukraine. And
Russian-made planes, right?
unclear to me. Certainly USSR made planes. I don't know if they were Russian made or what the story was.
Well, yeah, USSR for Cold War era fighters. Yeah.
But the thing that was crazy to me was that in a 24-hour period, you had the White House, the State Department, the Department of Defense, the Polish people, and NATO all releasing this contradictory statements. And in theory, all of these groups are supposed to be on the same side. And if you studied the Cuban Missile Crisis, you'll remember that Kennedy and his brother disagreed with the generals, but you didn't have the Pentagon issuing a press conference that was in opposition to what the White House was saying. You had this sort of unified front that the government took. And in this Polish MiG crisis, you had all of these different entities in the government, which I'll contend are all basically mafias, who are all trying to get their story out there first to take the high ground, if you will, narratively, right? So I think that, first of all, Owen, that is a really interesting question when you talk about friend versus enemy, because in theory, all of those entities, the White House, the State Department, the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, the NATO, and the Poles, they should have all been aligned, but they weren't. And so we saw that they weren't now, and we didn't see that before. And that, I think, gives us a broader sense of what's going on in society, right? Like there's this conversation around, has the US soft balkanized? Are there a bunch of different mafias, right? And a mafia is a 150 person group. And it basically, like, when your institution fails because it cannot reach consensus, and we could make an argument that because we can't agree on what the definition of a woman is, then our institutions have failed. Then what happens is that obviously the institution as a structure still exists, but it breaks into all of these factions, and humans can only really hold about 150 people in their relationship network. And so these factions, if you will, these mafias only get to be that big. And so they like vie for power inside the institution. And then we see this happening outside. And so then the question is like, who's a friend and who's an enemy? I don't really think of it like that at all. I think of it more like, whose interests are aligned with mine, and whose aren't. And keep in mind that some of these curators that we're talking about, they have an agenda. And when we're evaluating their information, we need to be really clear to understand what their bias is, and make sure that we're following them just for the topics that we are interested in. Like everyone, I have a bias, Wolf has a bias. That's more what it is, as opposed to friend and enemy. Sorry, Wolf.
I think, yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that, when I listen to the various kinds of influence I listen to, I mean, take like Ben Shapiro at the Daily Wire. He's conservative. He's very upfront about his bias. I'm not a conservative. I'm more libertarian leaning. Although, some, back in the 90s, some people would have called me a leftist because of certain things I ascribe to. Nowadays, a lot of people would call me on the right, but I see myself as on the side of freedom and personal autonomy. And whichever side is upholding those, I'm going to get identified more with that, but I personally identify with either. But I'm very upfront. My first principles, tend towards, personal sovereignty, even leaning towards anarcho-capitalist, and my politics lean towards libertarian. But I agree with what a lot of people on in certain groups are saying about the culture wars and things like that. And for me, but I don't agree with everything they say. And so I think being able to say, okay, I agree or I don't agree, and why, and this person is either helping me think about something, or they're telling me what to think without revealing their agenda. That's kind of how I do my identify friend and foe in situations like this. Because if they're telling me what to think without clearly identifying their agenda, or if they're failing to tell me how to think about things, because clearly they're not considering things from a more rounded point of view, then, or at least even they're not even aware of their opposition's arguments, I'll put it that way. That's a huge red flag for me. And so, yeah, I won't go listen to the Daily Wire one moment and then Young Turks on the next moment, because I don't find as much value in the Young Turks personally, but I will occasionally go listen to them just to see what they're saying. But that doesn't mean the truth is somewhere right between them either. I have to use my own ability to think critically about these things, and decide when they're making valid points. And I think that that's incumbent upon everybody who really wants a truly free society, is to think for themselves and pay attention to people who help them think for themselves instead of tell them what to think.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I use a very simple model as well, which is basically the novice, intermediate, expert model. So, and I try to orient both the person speaking and myself in that model, and I'll just give it very simply. A novice person is always concerned with what are the rules of an information space, right? And any human area can be basically broken down to 5 to 7 heuristics that define 70 to 80% of the outcomes in that area, right? And so I'm always, when I go and learn something new, I'm like, okay, what are the 5 to 7 key ideas that are going to define this space? That's me as a novice. Someone who's an intermediate is going to ask when and how those 7 rules are violated, and that experience of figuring out when and how those rules don't work is about exploring the frontier of a space, and that is where all the innovation happens. And then an expert is going to talk about why the rules of the novice are the way that they are. And so one thing that's really important for me is not to listen to people that say why something is if I don't even know what the rules are in a space. And that's how I can tell pretty quickly that I'm being, because I don't know, I don't have any basis, because I didn't do the hard work of the intermediate to figure out when and how the rules are violated. So then I can't figure out whether or not what somebody's saying is why. So if they say like, this is happening and this is why, that to me is the red flag, because I'm like, I'm actually a novice in this topic, not an expert.
And by the way, I want to continue inviting other speakers up. We've had a number of people join us, and really happy to have you here. And you're welcome to have the microphone as well. Owen or Andrew, if you want to ask or speak a follow up, then you're welcome to unmute and just go ahead and do that. Anybody else, just add yourself as a speaker. I'd be happy to bring you up. Owen.
Yeah. Well, another question I have is that, using this lens of an information war, like, what would it look like for a war to be won or lost? Or is it that we're just perpetually in a state of war and there is no real peace?
We are at war with East Asia. We've always been at war with East Asia.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, right? So I don't know what the answer to that is, and I don't know if we ever actually are going to see it in our lifetime. right? When the printing press was invented in the 1430s, we didn't get the Treaty of Westphalia until the 1740s, and arguably that whole thing didn't settle out until the development of nuclear weapons in 1945, right? How many generations was that? It's 400 years. So I don't know, Ann. I don't know, Owen. I think it may not be in our lifetime that we see this thing resolved, for sure.
Well, it
I think
just seems very complex to think about, in terms of a traditional war, because you have so many different factions, and it may look maybe a lot more like, back in the days of tribal warfare, where everybody might be fighting with everybody else, not necessarily having two aligned sides. And so, that might look a lot more like this, where it's like there is there isn't necessarily a clear distinction between war and peace anymore, because it's just every faction is going to continue to fight for their cause, right? And there may never be sort of a peace where that isn't happening.
I think we were definitely talking about, we were living in an age of fourth generation warfare where a lot of a lot of it is information and fighting for people's hearts and minds. I think that where the main stand we each have to take is as individuals and as people who are part of families, communities, is to make our first and best stand there, and then as we have energy, participate in the larger, um, you know, uh, conflict of winning people's hearts and minds, of being, of showing that we can be better than a lot of what gets thrown at us, and from politicians and the media and so on. It's really kind of raw sewage they're expecting us to consume.
Yeah, and if you read The Sovereign Individual, Owen, I'm pretty sure you have, the logic of violence is shifting, and we see that with the internet. And I do believe it's going to look a lot more like a hunter-gatherer society, or a lot more like a city-state wars, where it's like Venice versus Milan versus Rome versus everybody else, as opposed to these sort of, this is a settled issue in the empire. Because at any moment, your argument, your meme could convert somebody else. But yeah, I don't know what it looks like for it to be over. Maybe that means that we're not in a total information war, because there is no such thing as over. It's a good question.
So, Michael, one of kind of the key ideas that your career is revolving around is the idea of sense making, and maybe a number of people in our audience are not really familiar with the concept. I know that I think his name is Michael Snowden, who invented something called the Kinevin framework. He identifies sense making as a way of making sense of the world that allows us to operate within it. And that could be individuals or organizations or whatever. But how do you define sense making, and what would you say are some of the core tenets of how you teach sense making, and how people can go about figuring out how to work in move in the world effectively?
Yeah, I think, first of all, if you want a better understanding of the state of the art in sense making, I would direct you toward Daniel Schmachtenberger and Jordan Hall, and even John Robb. And they're Gen X guys and a boomer. And I think it's important to think about it in terms of generations, and I'm a millennial. So they have had decades on me in terms of theory of sense making and all of that. I am mostly concerned with what seems to work for me and the people that I talk about. But largely speaking, sense making is the system that we use to understand the reality that we exist in. And I think that one of the things from my perspective that the internet has done has made it very difficult, if not impossible, to quash minority reports, so-called minority reports, which would be positions. If you think of it like an ecology, it'd be a position in the information ecology that is true for people that stand in that position, right? So if you have 100 people and they're in a building, and 95 of them are in a room with windows that's open to the outside and lights coming in, and 5 of them are in a closet where there are no windows and it's dark, and you were to ask all of them, is it light or dark outside, or is it light or dark? 5 of them, the minority, would tell you it's dark, and 95 would tell you that it's light. And in a traditional world, we can suppress that minority report of the 5 in the closet and just say that it's light, and so these are the things that you should do. In our world, people get to choose whether to stand in the closet or not. And so they can actually stand in the dark. And so for them, the advice, bring a flashlight, be careful you don't run into people. It makes a ton of sense. And if you can't suppress the Minority Report, then a lot of things that I thought that I grew up with being told were objectively verifiably true. So when we talk about truth, sort of like, is it independently objectively verifiably true, turn out to be socially constructed. And even things like, is the sky blue, is a socially constructed answer. And basically, when you start recognizing that so much of what our reality is socially constructed, it's really a head fake.
But there's also, a lot of people using that idea of everything is a social construction to deconstruct, a lot of the fabric of society. I mean, you mentioned before, people being unable to define what a woman is, when, to many people growing up, the dictionary definition of adult human female is necessary and sufficient. A lot of people don't feel it's either at this point, or even very well definable. So how do you square those two things?
Yeah, I think this is one of the key problems that I have with the modern information system, is that it used to be very reductionist, very Newtonian, and now it's a lot more like quantum mechanical, in the sense that you're basically taking a derivative at the position you occupy in this space in order to come to what is true. And it goes on both sides. So like, you can use it for good or you can use it for ill. So you can use this idea of social construction in a bad way, or you can use it in a good way. And when I say good and bad, what I'm ultimately referring to is, what is the position that you stand in that's in the most resonance with the experience of reality that you have? So the reason why I make the choices that I make is because they have the greatest benefit to the mission and goals that I'm trying to accomplish. And I recognize there are people with different mission and goals from me who are going to make different choices. And if I listen to what they say, right, because this is kind of another thing on the internet, everyone is speaking the truth from their perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And just because it's a switch track, which is to say two arguments that don't go head to head, and the most classic one is pro-life, pro-choice,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's nobody who's anti-life or anti-choice. Those are very extreme positions.
Yes.
But there's very legitimate arguments for being both pro-life and pro-choice. They just end up screaming past each other, right? And so we literally had an example where Nancy Pelosi and Donald Trump were both on Twitter, and they said something that perceived to be the opposite, but was actually true to both of the sets of people, depending on if they followed Nancy Pelosi or Donald Trump. And that is, I think, is a real mind F for me, is that there's going to be people that are going to speak the truth, but because of the way that they describe their reality, it's not going to align with the way that I describe my reality. So I try to go and stand next to people, figuratively, who have the results that I want to have. I want to link authority and responsibility. I don't want institutional people in charge of making decisions for me that don't have any accountability.
Mm-hmm.
I seek out doctors who are healthy. I don't go to a dentist with messed up teeth. I don't get my hair cut by a bald woman, right? Like I go to the people in my homeschool pod, more or less believe similar things to me. And what I think will happen, and I don't want to get too esoteric about Twitter as a artificial general intelligence, but you can measure the amount of resonance or engagement for a particular point in relation to every other point in a space, to come at what it means to be true for that particular thing. And right. And that over time, people will migrate to the position that provides them the most value. And that is, at the core of, I know your question was about what is sense making, but sense making is just basically like, what is the operating system you were born with or developed accidentally? And for most people, it's something you pick up, like language. Even language itself is a sense making modality, right? Like, if you don't learn about the color blue, you don't see the color blue, right? Mm-hmm. There's tons of concepts. If you don't learn about them, you don't actually perceive them.
Right.
And so sense making as a discipline is recognizing, it's kind of like the David Foster Wallace, this is water. Okay. And then the one fish says to the other one, well, what's water? They don't even know, because it's what they exist in. Sense making for most people is the way that they're understanding and making decisions in the world. And I think it's too hard to fix our decision-making process, like, because I'm subject to all these biases and like emotional traumas. And I mean, it's really hard. Okay. So the way that I solve this whole problem is I just go upstream and say, like, okay, I'm just going to clean up the information that I consume so that as a consequence of that, I make better decisions. But like my actual decision making is not better. And so, in so many ways, sense making is that system that you have in place that allows you to understand the world. And from my perspective, if you're really clean about the information that you take in, then your downstream decisions are going to become better. And for most of us, that just means don't consume Kim Kardashian content, right? Like,
Yeah.
don't follow people on Twitter that say shit that makes you angry.
Well, I
Because
think if we
then,
look at a lot of what we consume, we can pretty much separate a lot of wheat from chaff and say, yeah, I could use more of the wheat, less the chaff. I mean, personally, I think that fostering a culture of being willing to be challenged about your ideas, even your deeply cherished ones, and be able to be willing to either stand and defend them or say, you're right, there's something I need to think about more deeply, to be willing to walk with Socrates and reach a point of knowing confusion, of aporia, I think is actually should be part of our culture, but has fallen out of disfavor. And personally, I would like to really bring that back, because I mean, I haven't always believed the things I believe now. And a big part of how I came to believe some of the things I believe now is because I was challenged on those things. And yet I don't see a lot of people being willing to give or receive that gift at this point. So that's one of my
yeah, but
huge
Wolf,
issues.
I mean, come on, people having to interrogate themselves is so difficult.
Yes,
Every
it
single
is.
day, there are people in this room right now who say things that I'm like, you can't honestly be right. And then I have to realize that it's myself who's wrong and that they're right. And that is so difficult. That is so
Absolutely,
hard,
absolutely.
man.
And
No
and
one's going to
and
do that.
and I've been wrong so many times, and I'm actually very happy when I'm shown to be wrong, because then I get to be more right going forward. And for me, in my mind, it's the same thing as going to the gym, or exercising one's will to, for example, as a creative, I'm a creative technologist. When I sit down to work, of knowing that I've triumphed over my desire to procrastinate and do other less important things for the more important thing, and so on. These things make you stronger, and I think that's all part of that. So if you're willing to eat well and exercise, you ought to be willing to exercise your mind as well, not just by merely not eating the donuts of thought, but also by being willing to really do the hard work to make sure that what you're eating isn't secretly donuts.
Yeah. All right. We got 3 minutes left because I also
Yep.
want to be very punctual for everyone who's here. I really appreciate the 20 or so people that have been here this whole time. Thank you, guys.
Absolutely.
Are there
Michael, do you
any?
want to talk about where you can be reached before we wrap up, and I'll do the same so we can.
Oh yeah, sure. So I've been trying unsuccessfully for 2-3 years now to teach this stuff to people. I find it very difficult. Originally, I taught a class. Now we got one more request, so I'll just finish that. Anyway, go ahead. Let's bring up Adam, actually. That's okay.
Yeah. So real briefly before Adam comes up, I'll just say, you can find me at the YouTube / Beware of Wolf podcast, where I do my videos on critical thinking and better thinking, at flyinglogic.com for my software. So let's see. Let me bring up our. Yeah, Adam.
Hey, Adam.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. And I want to thank you very much for this, Michael. I know this was a bit of a challenge for you. It's exciting to do spaces, I think. So thank you very much for allowing me to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, you're welcome, Adam. Thank you. Did you have a question for us?
I did. I thought it was something that I think about a lot, and this space has been very informative in many senses. So again, I want to thank you. And certainly you spend a lot of time thinking about information spaces and wars, and it definitely shows in what you've discussed. So question is that how do you try and explain to yourself or to children or to others, particularly to children, even if you're addressing yourself as a child, right? In this sense that I described, is how do you explain the way the world was, and try and give some type of a detailed kind of post-mortem on the way the world was in terms of its media, in terms of its freedom, and in terms of its civil rights, and in terms of all those kind of millions of discrete transactions that that consumed our days and our interpersonal relationships.
So are you asking about, Adam, how the milieu has kind of changed since, our youth to the younger generation at this point?
Well, I'm not asking how it's changed because I think we've all observed how it's changed. But I'm asking you
Mm-hmm.
how you explain to others how it's changed. In other words, if you've got, I'm just going to give a crazy scenario, right? A 10-year-old kid who's now growing up, and I'll make any age, okay? It doesn't make a difference, who doesn't really have a good sense of what it was before because they've grown up kind of intellectually and emotionally in this environment with remote learning and kind of a loss of intimacy and interpersonal relationships and all the things that, you've already discussed. So how would you explain to them the way the world was before? So, for example, a lot of us have grandparents
Okay,
and fathers
Adam,
who are,
because I don't want to go too far over, I think, Michael, do you understand the question? Would you like to respond?
Oh yeah, I love this question. I get it. I actually sidestepped this question, Adam, and the reason why I do is because, and I know that's not going to be a satisfying answer, but I have children, very young children, and then of course I have like other people who are that age, that say 10 years old. I don't think it's possible for them to understand the world that we grew up in. And so what I do instead, when they ask me, why is it that people are like this? I try to point out to them the things that are the same. The stories that we've told throughout our entire history have the same value system in them, the same morals, the same outcomes, and I try to relate it. So like love, I know, and maybe this is a little bit hippie, but I try to talk about it in terms of love. And I was like, people really care about each other and they really care about the things that they're going after, and they try to do it in the best way that they can. And what you experience of the world is much different from the experience of your elders. And this is very common. And it's always happened throughout history that the youth don't understand the elders and the elders don't understand the youth. And it's a little bit different. It's more pronounced now because of the very change. It's been a very rapid change. But what we should, instead of focusing on where you and that person may be different, let's focus on where you can be the same, so that when you're communicating with your grandparents or these older people, that you can focus on what matters, which is that value. And maybe that's not a satisfying answer, but that's what I've come to because, sorry, go ahead, Adam.
So my question really is, again, with this young child kind of in mind, who already has some type of a systems understanding that's good enough to get them to a kind of a complexity, is how would you explain to them all the social and economic and political disruption that we've seen, all the kind of extraordinary sensory, cognitive bombardment, all the kind of disequilibrium, and the way it was before when we didn't have that versus now? We've seen a total transformation of the entire world, and certainly of our political operating system and our people operating system. And how would you explain to them, how that differential, kind of the mathematics of how that happened?
Yeah, okay, so this gets into I think this is a much larger than a sit down one time conversation with a 10-year-old. I think it gets into, first of all, it starts with the admission that everything that we knew growing up and even the way that we understood information has changed. And it has been so radical so quickly for so many that it's been incredibly disorienting. And that if they're going to try to understand their elders, the people that existed in this previous environment, they're going to have to understand that the change has been so catastrophic. And I think the word catastrophic is actually appropriate. It's been so catastrophic that they're going to have empathy for that person who tries to explain it to them. And then I would go actually and talk about the different economic modalities that the human race has been involved in, specifically hunter-gathering, agriculture, industrial economics, and then finally information economics. And I would just explain that all of the people that are older than them have existed in both industrial economics and information. and that they only see the world through informational economics. And I'd be very clear to talk about that supply side, to talk about that demand side. I would be very clear to draw all of those contrasts, right? I would say, it used to be that you could just read the newspaper and watch the television for 30 minutes a day, and the next morning you'd go to work and you could talk about the same thing. And now that's not the case. Like literally every person that I know has a different media consumption habit. And so part of it is just we're all discovering like, hey, what did you watch? Hey, what did you watch? Hey, what did you watch? And the way that we're trying to understand the world is broken because and for so many ways, right? Like a lot of these kids, and actually this is a broader statement I try to make, which is the kids are going to be okay because the kids have figured it out. They figured it out because they've grown up natively into it. It's the Gen Xers and the millennials that are hosed, from my experience, right? Because we exist, and the boomers. I think the boomers are fine. They're just older, and so it's less relevant. They're not looking at 20, 30 working years trying to exist in this crazy environment. But the kids, I think they get it. They're just like, okay, yeah, this is the way it is now. And when I say, like, yeah, man, it's totally completely different. It's like being hit with a bus. And you have to have a lot of empathy for people. And then if they, yeah, that's Adam. That's where I would start, is basically to try and explain to them to have high empathy. And that this is really, it's very difficult for someone to be told. I mean, let's just talk about the CDC. Okay. So if you're a capital allocator, so you're a hedge fund guy, you have tons of money, billions of dollars, you listen to what the CDC has to say about infectious disease. And then COVID happens and they totally got it wrong, or they got it slow, however you want to look at it. And now you can't make capital allocation decisions on that. And now you're realizing that every single source that you used to go to for authoritative information has some kind of regulatory capture, right? It's like a gel man amnesia, where you wake up one day and realize that somebody's lying to you. And then you realize that they're all lying to you, and that maybe you're lying to yourself. And it's incredibly disorienting and you don't know what you're supposed to do. And so the only thing that you're left doing is figuring out for yourself, well, what is it that I really care about? What is it that we should really care about? What are the relationships like? And then let's focus on those. Anyway.
Yeah, I'll add one last thought before we wrap up, which is that teaching our young people to, above all, find common ground with other people. Like you just said, Michael, find what our shared objective is, find out what our shared values is, work from that point of view. That, if you have no shared objective, then, you basically, you're either at war or you just go your separate ways. But if you can find a common objective with other people, even people who you vehemently disagree with, then you actually have a basis to go on and build deeper understanding. Maybe they'll change, maybe you'll change, maybe neither of you change, but you still have that common objective. You still have a reason for being at peace with each other. So that's the thing I would emphasize to young people at this point. And
Yeah,
with
I mean,
that,
like,
I go
I was
ahead.
going to say, like, do the thought experiment. Like, you're going to tell somebody who's read the New York Times their entire life that the New York Times has become a partisan, hacky newspaper with an agenda. I mean, good luck.
Or NPR, which I grew up listening to.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, or whatever it is. I mean, like,
Yeah.
it's catastrophic, right? Imagine that you grow up in a household and every Sunday your parents read the newspaper, and that's how you learn what it means to be educated. You're like, oh, I love my parents. They read the newspaper. They're informed. They know what's going on in our community. And so you associate reading the newspaper every week with being informed. And so then as an adult, you read the newspaper every week to be informed. But then the entire business model of the news changes in the last 20 years. And so now you're being misinformed as much as you're being informed. And your entire identity as somebody who's educated is wrapped up in reading that newspaper. And then how do you explain that to somebody who never will read a newspaper? I mean, it's just, Adam, it's such a ridiculously hard question. That's why I think we should sidestep it. No, I would like to say I really appreciate everybody coming. We're going to do this again next week. If you want to reach out via Twitter to Wolf or I on topics that you specifically want to talk about, please do. I think next week I'm going to talk a little bit more about how to construct a sense-making environment. That's kind of going to be my focus. But yeah, I really appreciate everybody's time today. And Wolf, thank you for hosting it.
So yeah, and again, thank you everybody. I really appreciated it. Hope this grows, and really enjoyed everything that was said.
Thank you so much, Wolf, and we'll see you guys next week.
Yeah, next week at 1 p.m. Pacific, we'll be here again, and we're going to continue this conversation. Thank you everyone for joining us. See you next week.